Hello and welcome to the National Security Conversation. US President Donald Trump is in the midst of his first ever visit to India. So what explains Trump's short and quick visit to India at this point of time? Is it about trade? Is it about Afghanistan? Or is it, as some people seem to argue, about the Indian American voters in the United States? How should we view contemporary India-US relations? Where do India-US relations stand at this point of time? There seems to be a lot of warmth and positivity between the two sides, and yet there is some discomfort beneath the surface. Despite the public display of affection between Trump and Modi, trade tensions have been increasing between the two sides. It started with the US raising the import duty on Indian steel and aluminium products as national security measures against a country that is supposed to be America's strategic partner. India retaliated by dragging the United States to the dispute settlement mechanism of the World Trade Organization and increased duties on the import of 29 products from the US, including almonds, walnuts, and pulses. To increase the pressure, from June 2019, the US suspended India's special status under the generalized system of preferences that provided duty-free access to $5.6 billion worth of Indian exports to the United States. The US also took steps before the Trump visit that can hardly be considered friendly. It, for example, declared India as a developed country last week, making it ineligible for preferential treatment in certain global trade practices. The Indian media may have spinned the developed nation tag in a positive way, but this is hardly beneficial for India by any stretch of imagination. The visit is coming in the midst of a new US rapprochement towards Pakistan, US trade war with China, pressure on Iran, and a renewed peace process in Afghanistan. To discuss these issues, I have with me Jeff Smith. Jeff is a research fellow at the Heritage Foundation's Asian Studies Center focusing on South Asia. He is the author or editor of Asia's Quest for Balance, China's Rise and Balancing in the Indo-Pacific, and of Cold Peace, China-India Rivalry in the 21st Century. Smith formerly served as the Director of Asian Security Programs at the American Foreign Policy Council. Welcome to the National Security Conversation, Jeff.
It's good to be here.
If I may begin by asking you what brings President Donald Trump to India at this point of time. Is it trade? Is it Afghanistan? Or is it, as some people say, the Indian American voters in the United States?
I think there were probably several motivations, but I do think it's fair to identify trade as one of the original motivations. I do think that there was an expectation that by now we would have come to agreement on a modest trade deal, that the USTR would have visited India about a week and a half ago to sign this deal. And I think there was actually some speculation that when the deal did not come together, that POTUS's visit may have been off. And so I actually commend the president for deciding to move forward with the visit, even without a modest trade deal, because we do know that the president places a great deal of importance on trade and economics.
Right.
We do know that USTR holds a lot of influence in the White House. And so I think the original motivation surrounding the timing probably was tied to the trade deal, but there's also, I think, a broader sense that the India-US relationship is deeply important to the administration's own Indo-Pacific strategy. And I think there was a recognition that the president really did need to make at least one trip to India during his first term, and we're running out of time. And so for that to happen, I think this was a good window of opportunity. So I think trade, I think the strategic partnership, probably the notion that we would get a few defense deals signed helped. And it all came together for what was a rousing reception today at the stadium in Gujarat.
You are traveling from DC and you just came here yesterday. What's your sense of the agenda items on the agenda at this point of time when Mr. Modi and Mr. Trump sit down to talk business? What are some of the things? I mean, is it going to be a lot of talk on trade, or would, say, regional security be a part of that agenda? What's your sense?
I think security will be high on the agenda, in part because that's where we have the greatest convergence in some ways. I think there's no question that there are common challenges in the region related to China, related to terrorism. I think the two sides have articulated very similar visions for a free and open Indo-Pacific. I think that they're going to have frank conversations on the question of 5G. This has been a big issue for the Trump administration. They and myself and we at Heritage have real concerns about what will happen for countries that are bringing untrusted vendors into their 5G networks, how that could impact their security and sovereignty, how that could impact our ability to share intelligence with them. And so I know the president's point man on this question is the National Security Advisor, and he's traveling with the president. There's also a very big economic team in place. I do suspect they will be talking about business opportunities. I suspect they'll continue to provide high-level signaling to their respective negotiating teams to get a trade deal done. I think they're still hopeful that sometime in the months ahead, or maybe next year after the U.S. election, that we will be able to hammer out at least a modest trade agreement. I think that's important for the relationship. I think there's potential for greater friction if we're not able to reach a trade deal. So I do expect that to be high on the agenda. I suspect they'll also be talking about connectivity initiatives in the region. I think the U.S. and India, frankly, share some concerns about China's Belt and Road Initiative, the way some of these connectivity projects have been unfolding, about debt trap diplomacy, the sustainability of these projects. And like the free and open Indo-Pacific, I think we've articulated very similar visions for what infrastructure should look like.
I'll come to that in a second, but I just
sure.
want to sort of push you on the issue of 5G. That seems to be the talk of the town at this point of time. But even the American allies are probably not standing by the United States on 5G issue. The Britain, for example, decided not to stand by the United States. So does the Trump administration therefore believe that the Indians are actually going to stand by the, what's the sense in DC at this point of time?
Well, I would hesitate to frame it as standing by the U.S. or China. I understand why it's framed that way. The UK found itself in the unfortunate position of having Huawei infrastructure already in its 3G and 4G networks. And so they found themselves in a situation where not going with Huawei for 5G would prove much more costly than it would for countries that don't have Huawei already embedded throughout their telecommunications infrastructure. We still think they're making the wrong decision. We still think, even though it would be costly to go with an alternative, the cost of finding out farther down the road that there are major espionage concerns with a company that's already embedded in your system will be far greater. The cost to your security, but also the direct financial costs. And so, look, sovereign countries are free to make decisions.
Can you unpack that
own.
for us? Economic and security costs of 5G, as it were, in the longer run. What do you mean? You are a China expert. Tell us, explain to our viewers what that means.
Well, what I mean to say is, if you have bet wrong, and the British are essentially telling us that they're going to make a bet that they can contain the espionage concerns related to Huawei. And their intelligence agencies have actually been delicate on this issue and said there are risks, but we do have some confidence we can mitigate those risks. Now, if you made the bad bet and you find out years down the road that in fact you couldn't mitigate those risks, you now have an entire infrastructure built out with Huawei embedded, and trying to rip it out of the system and replace it with alternatives after the fact will prove far more costly than had you just gone with trusted suppliers to begin with. And frankly, the UK's reasons for allowing Huawei in have changed and morphed over time. Some of them are economic, some of them are the fact they argue there are no alternatives. Of course there are alternatives. In fact, there are European alternatives. And they say, well, we're going to keep them to just a third of our 5G infrastructure to help try and mitigate the risks further. Well, that acknowledges that there's a security risk emanating from them. And they've sort of argued, well, we want to have a diverse group of suppliers. We don't want to put all our eggs in one basket. I don't particularly find these different arguments convincing. What we do know is that it would be costlier for them to go with an alternative, and we do know that China puts the pressure on. and it says to you, other economic incentives, other deals will not come to fruition unless you let Huawei in. And they're very good at wielding carrots and sticks to get this done. But we do know that it's very possible to build a 5G network without Huawei. We're doing it now. Vietnam is doing it. There are alternative suppliers, Samsung, Nokia, Ericsson. So I think it's a canard, this idea that there are no other options. There absolutely are.
Interesting. Thank you for that very interesting answer. Let's go back to the Indo-US relations for a minute. How do you view the state of Indo-US relations at this point of time? There seems to be a lot of positivity and warmth between the two leaders, but what's boiling beneath the surface? Is there a trade war? I know I'm exaggerating my argument here, but is there a trade war in the offing between the United States and India? There seems to be a lot happening at this point of time.
Yes, I don't think there's a trade war happening right now. I think there have been some elevated tensions on trade over the past few years. Excuse me, to be honest, there has been discontent with some of the trade relationship and some Indian trading practices, some barriers to investment and trade. That's existed in Washington for many, many years. However, there has been such strong bipartisan consensus behind the security relationship that they have always sort of tamped down some of these voices and grievances related to the economic angle. With this president, you have an administration that is very much focused on trade and investment. And you have a U.S. trade representative that's very much empowered. So it wasn't entirely surprising to see trade rise in the hierarchy of priorities for the U.S. government. So we've seen sparring on GSP, on steel and aluminum tariffs, on developing nation status, and it's gone.
Although we played it very well in India, saying that the United States made us a developed nation.
Right, of course.
So we are very happy about it. But
well, but it goes both ways. What I have argued is, I think what could really blow this open would be a Section 301 investigation in the United States. Were they to open a Section 301 investigation against India, it would provide USTR with a wide array of tools to impose very punitive sanctions that I think would make GSP and all these other irritants look very mild by comparison. And so were that to happen, then I think we can begin to talk about real potential for a trade war. Thus far, we've been able to stave that off with the promise of a modest trade deal, but that promise keeps getting delayed and pushed back. And so I hope both sides have not become complacent, because I do think that threat still looms on the horizon if the two sides are unable to come to some kind of agreement.
But here is the problem. The United States is pushing India economically at a point of time when the United States economy is doing very well, yes, and the Indian economy is down in the dumps. Yes. So I understand, friendship and morality doesn't matter in international politics, but here is a problem, because if the American side pushes India beyond a point, the Indians will not be able to deliver, simply because their economy is not doing well at all.
So I don't want to get too far outside of my purview because I'm not an economist, but I think what American economists would tell you is that much of what the United States is pushing is not intended to slow Indian growth. Much of what the U.S. is urging India to do would, over the long term, help India grow faster by opening up its markets, by opening up investment opportunities. This can cause short-term pain. It can provoke, discontent among certain specialized interest groups. But over the long term, it is better for the economy. It will make the Indian economy more competitive. And so I don't think the U.S. looks at it and says, well, India's growing slow, maybe we shouldn't push so hard. I think, if anything, they think India's growing slower, it's time to jumpstart and reform the economy even more. And we also, I think the United States and India both find ourselves outside of some recent multilateral trading arrangements looking in. And maybe as the two outliers, we have even more of an interest in promoting bilateral trade and investment, because we are two very large, prosperous economies, and we can help each other.
There has been a lot of bonhomie between Trump and Modi. Some people make the argument that Mr. Trump is perhaps using this relationship for his own electoral gains in the United States. For example, when Mr. Modi recoined this famous slogan, "Ab ki baar Trump Sarkar." But is it a good idea for an Indian government to be partisan towards a particular political party in the United States? What if there is a new government after Mr. Trump next year?
Very good question. I think that, first of all, I don't think it's unusual for a visiting official to heap praise on the American president or his host. There's really nothing unusual about that at all. I will say, to your point, though, I think it is a strength of the India-U.S. relationship that it is bipartisan. And I think people that wish well for India-U.S. relations should recognize how important it is that both parties in both countries have sustained the commitment to the relationship. And I think whether you're a conservative or a Democrat, if you care about foreign policy, whether you're BJP or Congress, you want sustained support from both parties in the relationship. So I don't think it's a good thing if it becomes too partisan. I don't necessarily think praising President Trump while you're giving a speech in the U.S. is excessively partisan, but I think we should be aware of the risks of going down that path. And I think both sides should do their best to maintain outreach to both parties, because we are democracies. Right. Governments change. It's inevitable. And we want the relationship to remain on a consistent trajectory regardless of who's in power.
Right. There has been a lot of criticism in the United States in the recent past about India's new Citizenship Amendment Act and what India did in Kashmir in August last year. And this criticism is not only from the civil society in the United States, also from within the US Congress. How is this going to impact India-United States relations in the foreseeable future, as it were? I know it's the president stands by, for most part, the Indian decision in Kashmir, as it were. But is there a downside to it in the days to come, in the months to come, in the years to come?
Well, I try to make a distinction between voicing concern about developments, which is essentially what has happened in the U.S. so far. Several U.S. congressmen, but frankly, even the Trump administration. You can go to statements by the State Department, and they have repeatedly said, we're concerned about security crackdown in Kashmir, about detained politicians. We hope that there's a lifting of the restrictions soon. That's inevitable in a democracy, particularly one like the United States. There's always going to be interest groups, members of Congress, who are concerned about foreign developments. I make a distinction between voicing concern and changing policy. And I think what some more robust critics of India in the U.S. would like to see is a changing of policy toward India, or punitive measures, or even sanctions at the more extreme end. And that is where I would be opposed, at least based on what's transpired to date, but also think that that could lead to real friction in the relationship were the U.S. to try to take a more interventionist approach in Indian domestic politics. Even short of that, though, I think we have to be cognizant of the possibility that the next time there is a Democratic administration that comes to power in Washington, they could take a more proactive approach. Even it may just be vocal with their concerns, but that could shade the relationship. It could lead to more challenging optics. I think both sides have to at least be prepared for that possibility, that Indian domestic politics, which have traditionally not played a very large role in bilateral relations, are now one component of the relationship that wasn't there before. It's unfamiliar. And so for now, I don't think it has caused any major disruption in the relationship. And I think, if we continue to see restrictions in Kashmir lifted, who knows how some of these debates are going to play out in the Supreme Court? Who knows how they're going to play out in elections? State elections have been quite unpredictable in India recently. My personal view is that there's a fight going on, on some very contentious domestic issues, a fight for India's future. I think it's better for India and for the U.S. if that fight comes from within. I do find India to be a robust democracy with real democratic judicial institutions. I prefer to see democracies play these issues out on their own terms. I think America does have a responsibility to speak up and to intervene when it's troubled by developments abroad, but I think that responsibility is much greater in non-democracies, where people don't have a voice, where people don't have institutions, where people don't have the possibility to weigh in on these matters.
I think this is an interesting distinction that you made between concern, voicing concern, and policy change. But let's look at it from a slightly different point of view, from a, say, geopolitical point of view. What is happening in Kashmir will be impacted also by, say, US-Pakistan relations, US withdrawal from Afghanistan as and when that happens, because the ability of the Pakistani deep state to play spoil sport in Kashmir will also be determined by how much the Americans are going to tolerate that, and also the ability of the Pakistanis to deliver Afghanistan, quote unquote, as far as the US is concerned. So how are some of these calculations going to impact Kashmir and the unfolding of the Kashmir conflict, as it were, in the days to come?
Yeah, I maybe would ask you to tease that out a little more, because I don't necessarily see as direct of a connection there. I don't see American tolerance for Pakistani terrorism in Kashmir rising and falling with the Taliban peace negotiations. I think we've moved past the stage where the United States is going to look the other way if groups like LET and JEM are conducting terrorist attacks. I simply don't think we're going back to that place. I don't think there's any tolerance in the U.S. for Pakistani support for terrorism at all. Now that, to me, is a little bit separate from what's been happening with this status of Kashmir, the Union Territory, the statehood question and the restrictions in the valley. So I don't know if I make that correct connection there.
I'll tell you what the connection that I'm making is the following.
Yeah.
When you have these restrictions and a change of politics in Kashmir, there will be a lot of disillusionment and disaffection within the Kashmir Valley among the Kashmiris. Now, on their own, the Kashmiris may not be able to do anything without, say, if they want to take up arms at the end of the day, without help from Pakistan. Now, if the entire international community is focused on Kashmir, is sort of telling the Pakistanis not to play sport in Kashmir, they may not be able to do that. But if there is a useful conversation going on between the United States and Pakistan on the question of Afghanistan, my own feeling is that, and history tells me that it is possible that the Americans would look the other way because they don't want to irk the Pakistani generals when they are up to something in Kashmir.
Well, I have to say, past history may give you some reason to hold those beliefs, but I would find it very difficult to imagine a scenario now in which the U.S. was permissive of Pakistan using terrorism as a state objective anymore. I mean, President Trump just a few hours ago was delivering a speech in which he specifically named radical Islamic terrorism, and in which he talked about terrorists operating from within Pakistani borders. There has been a change in mindset toward Pakistan in the U.S. Too late, in my opinion, one that should have come much earlier. But over the last 8, 9, 10 years, you have seen a great disillusionment set in among U.S. policymakers with Pakistan and with its support for terrorism. Now, over the past few months, you have seen a slight warming of the relationship as Pakistan has positioned itself to try and help with peace negotiations. But I really am skeptical that this will result in a return to normalcy. I don't think we're going back to the old chapter. I don't think we're ever going to rehyphenate the relationship again. And I don't think the Washington establishment will ever look the other way as Pakistani deep state supports terrorism the way it did. I really don't.
That's good news. Let's sort of shift our focus to Indo-Pacific. Do you think, looking at the statements coming from Washington on Indo-Pacific and from Delhi on Indo-Pacific, do you think they share a worldview or a philosophy on sort of how to navigate their respective strategies vis-a-vis Indo-Pacific, or do you think they're thinking very differently?
I think there's a tremendous deal of convergence, actually. If you parse the statements and speeches by Prime Minister Modi and Indian government officials and those delivered by President Trump and US officials, and you look at how they articulate their visions for the Indo-Pacific and what the underlying tenets and principles are, if you took the names off of the speeches, you wouldn't know which country was delivering it. That's how similar the two are, I think, in the language they're using to talk about the Indo-Pacific. I think India's placed a little more emphasis on the inclusive nature of the Indo-Pacific. It's not designed against anyone. I think they've been successful in persuading the Trump administration to talk a little bit more about ASEAN centrality. That's been another key component of it. But it's more tinkering at the margins. On the core underlying principles and objectives, I think the two are in tremendous agreement. And in fact, they just came into a slightly greater agreement when the Trump administration decided to change the geographic boundaries of the Indo-Pacific to align with India's. So previously, the western border of the Indo-Pacific for us was the west coast of India. For India, it was the east coast of Africa. And I was one of the few in Washington, I think, who was arguing we should expand it. We should use this broader geographic definition because we can't cut out half of the Indo. You can't cut half of the Indo out of the Indo-Pacific.
That's right.
What's happening in the Western Indian Ocean matters. What's happening in Gwadar matters to the broader trends in the Indo-Pacific. What's happening in Djibouti matters. And so I was very pleased to see the Trump administration has effectively accepted that new geographic conception, which I think brings us even more into alignment.
I see the argument that you're making about the alignment and convergence, but let's address the elephant in the room, and that's China. On the question of China and the future of the Indo-Pacific strategy for the United States and for India, where do you see this convergence sort of slipping away, as it were? Or do you see this convergence slipping away at all when it comes to the question of China?
Well, I personally have argued that I think the convergence is getting greater on China. I think you had a situation a few years ago where India was alone in opposing the Belt and Road Initiative, the only country on earth. This is President Xi Jinping's signature geopolitical, geoeconomic, strategic initiative written into the Chinese constitution. And to its credit, somewhat departure from its traditions, India was the lone vocal objector to this. And I would note that it was returning to the U.S. after a trip to India that Secretary of Defense Mattis in 2017 gave congressional testimony where he effectively said the Trump administration is against the BRI. We have very major concerns about the BRI now. And since then, you've seen much stronger position against the BRI from the U.S., but also Australia and other partners. So I think on that issue, certainly you have now more alignment on one of the more divisive China-related issues of the day, on the Quad, an issue that we once did not necessarily see eye to eye on, or India at least resisted the idea of reforming the Quad. We now have not only got the band back together, but we've upgraded it to the ministerial level. Again, this is not a China containment policy, but I think it would be a mistake not to recognize that shared concerns about China are one thing that bring the four countries together. I think, neither of us wants to portray the relationship as directed against China. I think for good reason, because I think the relationship is broader than China. But I think we would be kidding ourselves if we didn't acknowledge that our concerns about China are aligned and growing. And I do think I do think we're seeing more and more eye to eye on China.
Assuming that there is a containment strategy in the United States, containment of China strategy in the United States at this point of time, how wise is it for India to align itself with the United States as far as that China containment strategy is concerned? At the end of the day, let's face it, geography matters, location matters. The United States is located where it is, and India is located next door to China. Yeah. So it's a neighbor, it's India's biggest trading partner in goods, and here is a neighbor that you can't ignore. So India's position or positioning towards China will have to be more nuanced than, say, what the Americans can afford to relate with, or how the Americans can afford to relate with China. Don't you agree?
I think India has a complex calculation in how it deals with China and how it balances its relationship with China and the U.S. I think that's fair to say. I think India is more vulnerable to China, given the geography, given the power imbalance. India is still the junior partner in the China relationship. India is not protected by thousands of miles of ocean and a network of allies and military bases. But you could almost flip that logic on its head and say, without being overly provocative toward China, because that benefits nobody, just to provoke China for no reason. I would not ever counsel the U.S. or India to do that. You could argue that because India is vulnerable, it has an even greater need for friends and partners. And China is going to look out for its own interests regardless. And is India better trying to defend its interests alone or with friends and partners? And I would argue, and senior officials in the Indian government have argued to me, that the partnership with the U.S. has actually strengthened our hand in dealing with China. That if the Chinese feel like they can bully you around and push you around, they're going to take what they can get. But the Chinese respect strength. And even if they don't act like it, even if they pretend not to treat you as a peer, they do take notice when you have powerful friends. And so, if I were sitting in Delhi, I would be trying not to provoke China, certainly, but to be strengthening my own capability to defend myself, which is internal balancing, military power, but external balancing as well, and forging as many strategic partnerships as I can. And what I wouldn't do is limit my options out of deference to Chinese sensitivities. That's what I would be cautious of. So I want to do this thing with the United States, but I don't want to irritate China. Does China say, I want to do this with Pakistan, but I don't want to irritate India? Or does China do whatever it feels is in its interests, regardless of how India feels? And so that's where I would sort of counsel my Indian friends not to let China limit what is in their own strategic interest. And I would also question the theory that China punishes India, or India should be concerned about retribution from China if it were to take these steps toward greater partnership with the U.S. Because there's actually not empirical evidence to suggest that is the case.
Put differently, is it a bad idea necessarily for India to have an enduring partnership with China for that matter? Why should India limit its options and go only with the United States, have a relationship with the United States, have another one with China? I mean, on the BRI question, there is of course the official narrative in India, which is pretty anti-BRI, but there are mixed arguments in Delhi itself on the BRI question. And one of the arguments is that, hey, we need to look at BRI slightly differently because the neighborhood requires a certain amount of infrastructure development, and we are unable to provide that sort of help to the neighborhood. And secondly, if the Chinese build roads or railways in the neighboring countries, it's not going to be that only China is going to use those infrastructure that it is developing in those countries. India will also be able to use those. So it's a mixed reality seen from Delhi, and therefore I understand the CPEC argument, which has its own issues as far as sovereignty is concerned. But would it be wise for India, given this background, that India picks and chooses what it wants to be part of vis-a-vis the larger BRI family of networks, as it were?
Yeah, I think it is. I think that's right. And I think some American analysts get ahead of themselves when they suggest that other countries must cut off all engagement with China. Who is our largest trading partner? China. We cannot lecture to the rest of the world that you can't have any business with China when they're our largest trading partner. We do business with China. It's an inevitability. And so I would never sort of counsel my colleagues here to cut off all engagement with China. It's not practical. It's not beneficial. But I would like us to apply a little more scrutiny to that engagement. And there are some specific sectors, like technology, where maybe we do need to be a little more disciplined and a little more rigorous in how we review that engagement. Not because we're anti-Chinese, but because they have a track record that is quite troubling. I mean, there's empirical evidence to suggest it would be rational to approach some of this engagement with a skeptical eye, without making a sort of blanket policy that we're not going to have engagement with China at all. I think that would be a mistake.
Sure. One last question about Afghanistan. In 2017, while announcing his new South Asia strategy, President Trump said that, quote unquote, India makes billions of dollars in trade with the United States, and we want them to help us more with Afghanistan. What does he mean by that? Does he mean sending troops to India, sending troops to Afghanistan, or is it something else?
Well, I haven't been very good at mind reading with the president, so I don't know exactly what he had in mind there. I think there's a broad recognition that India has been an extremely constructive partner in Afghanistan, from an economic perspective, from a people-to-people perspective. By most polls, most indications suggest that Afghan people are overwhelmingly favorable toward India. India has a lot of soft power there. India has used its influence in constructive ways, so naturally I think the more India can do to help the Afghan government, the better. And that wasn't always the American thinking on the subject. There was a period, roughly a decade ago, where I think there was more deference to Pakistani sensibilities. There was fear of provoking threat perception in Islamabad if India were to become too active in Afghanistan. And I think we've moved away from that thinking. But I also think, personally, we're still quite a ways away from a formal request to have India send troops to Afghanistan. It's a very sensitive and fraught proposition, in my opinion.
So do you personally support the argument that India should send troops to Afghanistan? You don't?
I would be skeptical, but I would be willing to review and consider that proposal.
Why do you be skeptical?
I would be skeptical because I think the Indian government is skeptical of doing so, first and foremost. But I also think that would hold potential to further incite terrorism from some of Afghanistan's neighbors. And so, of course, I would welcome the idea of more friendly soldiers and forces in Afghanistan to help keep the peace. But I would want to be very certain that the government here really wanted to pursue that goal, that the Afghan government really thought that this was in their best interest, and that there were a lot of contingency plans in place for what would happen if we did see an uptick in terrorism and violence, which sadly would be a real possibility. Having said all that, under the right conditions, certainly could be beneficial to Afghan security, but I would want to check a lot of boxes before we got to that place.
Sure, wonderful talking to you.
It's good to be with you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.